I think we can get started for the day. So welcome everyone to our GrowNYC workshop. I'm Laura Casarigola. I'm joined today with Colleen and Sophia. We all work for the School Gardens program at GrowNYC, and we are very excited to present You Can Eat That, Edible Weeds and More. So let's get into the workshop. We are GrowNYC. We're a nonprofit organization that protects the environment, creates green spaces, helps people stay healthy, and gives them opportunities to make a positive impact. In today's workshop, you can submit questions using the Q&A function. So if you look in the bottom of your toolbar, there's something called Q&A. Please put your questions throughout the workshop in there. It'll make it easier for us to find them at the end of the workshop and do that for the Q&A. We are recording today's workshop, so we'll be able to send you the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow. And in that email, we'll have additional resources and things that we talk about in the workshop. So don't worry if you don't have to take notes today or write everything down or take screenshots. We'll send you all the resources we talk about. And you can find the recording and resources, as well as a lot of other virtual workshops and resources on GrowNYC, distancelearning.org. Next slide. So the agenda for today's workshop is first we'll just go into what is foraging, the definition of it, and what it can mean. Then we'll talk about common edible weeds that a lot of gardeners have in their gardens that just occur there naturally. We're going to go into some underutilized plant parts that you might not have known are edible and what you can do with them. And then we'll briefly list some edible flowers as well that you might not be aware are edible. Next slide. All right. So first, I did want to give a definition of foraging, which in the very simple sense is just searching for wild food sources. I did want to preface the edible weeds workshop with acknowledging where a lot of this knowledge comes from. So when we're looking for edible weeds and things like that, it is a branch of foraging. And foraging is rooted in a history of African American, and indigenous food traditions. And throughout history, many marginalized groups have been discouraged or actively prevented from accessing foraging. So we did feel it's important to mention this. And if you have an interest in foraging and you want to keep learning more about it, there's a lot of amazing resources and educators out there. One really popular one from the past year, which some of you might have heard of, is Alexis Nicole Nelson, who goes by the handle Black Forager on TikTok and Instagram. She makes amazing content, kind of like inspiring people and teaching them about foraging and its context in African American and indigenous food. There's also Braiding Sweetgrass was a really big book that came out in the last couple of years that goes into the indigenous culture of foraging as well. So it's something I'm still learning about a lot and always looking for more sources as well. So if you know of anything, feel free to put it in the chat and just keep learning about this. Next slide. So all of this is to say we want to make sure that we're foraging responsibly. So you only want to take from where it is permitted. And if you're tuning in today from New York City, there's actually laws here against foraging in parks and public spaces like that. So you do want to be aware of what the rules are and the spaces you're taking up in. So a lot of today's workshop is kind of geared towards what you can forage from your own garden and or a community garden or a school garden, places like that. If you're foraging from your own spaces, you also can ensure that there's no pesticides or herbicides, car pollution, or soil contaminants where you're foraging from. Another guideline for foraging responsibly is to take only what you're like 100% sure you're identifying it correctly. You want to make sure you're not depleting the source and taking too much if it's something that you want to make sure is still in your garden. There are some things that, I'll tell you later, mugwort, that's one you can take as much as you want, but there are certain things that you want to be aware of how much you're taking so that you don't deplete the source. And then always being respectful of people who might be using the land to forage as a necessary and or cultural practice. And then one last disclaimer before we get into the weeds is to consult a medical professional first if you're unsure about allergies or some reaction that you may have to edible weeds, because it's not things that are part of our common mainstream diet. So just to keep that in mind. All right, next slide. Let's start talking about the weeds. You can bring us to the next one. So someone in the chat was asking, as we were trickling in today, is crabgrass a weed? And the funny thing is there's not like a list of this is a weed, this is not a weed, because it's kind of based on context. So a weed is anything in our garden we didn't intentionally plant. So they propagate and spread on their own without human interaction. So that's also to say weeds are not all bad, and the definition of a weed is subjective and changes based on context. For example, on a manicured lawn, grass isn't considered a weed. It's supposed to be there, we want it there, we put it there. But in a garden bed, if you see grass coming up in between your vegetables, you're like, oh, that grass is a weed. So you can see that it changes based on what you're attempting to do in the space. Next slide. The first weed that I want to go over, this one is really common. I've seen it all over the US whenever I've been in a garden, is Purslane. And it's a succulent with red stems and rounded green leaves. In the spring, it's smaller and it can grow to be a lot bigger. It is similar to spinach and watercress, and it's you can eat the leaves and the stem. It's crunchy, and it definitely has a high water content to it. It's a little like juicy as well. You can stir fry it if you want. You can just eat it raw and crunch on it. When we give garden tours, we'll allow students to rip off a piece and just eat it straight from there, raw. And I was reading in a Healthline article that purslane is so high in nutrients that calorie for calorie, it is one of the most nutrient dense foods on the planet. It has significant amounts of vitamin A, C, magnesium, manganese, potassium, iron, and calcium. So if you're looking for the next superfood, you might want to do some research into purslane. Next slide. So lamb's quarter is the next one that I wanted to show you all today. It's part of the amaranth family. The amaranth family includes beets, chard, quinoa, and spinach, and lamb's quarters. So you can identify lamb's quarters by the shape of the leaf. Some people describe the shape as looking like a goose foot because it kind of has that shape to it if you use your imagination. And it also has kind of like a dusty white coating on new growth and on the underside of the leaves. So a lot of people will use this for the leaves. That's like the most edible part. It tastes a lot like spinach. You can eat it raw, you can blanch it, boil it, you can even grind it up and use it as a flour additive. Lamb's quarters is actually sometimes sold at farmers markets in New York City. I've seen it sold at some of the farm stands there. And in many regions of the world, particularly in India and Pakistan, people intentionally grow lamb's quarters as an agricultural crop. The leaves are, again, really high in vitamins A and C, as well as calcium, iron, and it even has protein in it. So something else cool about lamb's quarters is unlike a lot of other edible weeds that get more bitter the older they are, lamb's quarters retains a mild spinachy flavor and they don't get bitter. So that's lamb's quarters. Next one. Lemon wood sorrel is one that I saw quite a few people in the chat put as one of their favorite weeds. This one is native to North America. It's called lemon wood sorrel because it has oxalic acid and it tastes like lemon. So it kind of, we describe it as like the lemon candy of the plant world. And you can eat the leaves, you can eat the flowers. The buds are especially like a fun pop, almost like eating a gusher. This is how we convince young students to try these things when we take them on garden tours. And so you can add them straight to salads as a little, punchy lemon flavor. You can also steep the leaves and flowers in hot water and make a lemon tea. It will be quite tart. As a warning, you might want to sweeten it with something. And with these ones, the oxalic contains oxalic acid, which a lot of other things we eat contain that as well. But that means you don't want to eat it like for every meal, every day, just a huge heaping bowl of lemonwood sorrel. So you want to have it in moderation. All right, next slide. So dandelions is another one that seemed to be a popular favorite from the audience. And these are something that I feel like I grew up in the suburbs, and these were kind of like the bane of a suburban lawn. People were always trying to get rid of dandelions, but it turns out they're actually great for pollinators. They're super important, especially in a city ecosystem, because they can grow, just in the smallest nooks and crannies in between pavement and things like that. They're one of the first sources of pollen and nectar in the spring. They have a very long taproot, which allows it to go and dig up vitamins and minerals from the soil really deep down and keep the soil from becoming too compacted. So dandelions are a very cool and sometimes underrated weed. You want to eat them, the green part, the leaves, when they're young, because as they get older, they do get quite bitter. So if you want to eat dandelion greens, that's something to do in the spring, pretty much. And that's something else I've also seen being sold at farmers markets. But if you have, a garden or a green space that you have access to, you can get that for free. So you can boil the greens, which helps reduce the bitterness, and you can saute them in oil and garlic. They taste really good as just, any other type of green that you would add to eggs or a stir fry or anything like that. The flowers are also edible. So you can sprinkle them on salad or on top of cakes. They don't have that much of a flavor, but they do look really cool. Another way to use them that you might see is dandelion root tea. And that's more of a involved process of drying out the roots and grinding it up for tea. But that's a really popular medicinal use as well. Next slide. And if anyone has questions or you have suggestions of anything, the ways that you use these plants, feel free to put it in the chat as well.
So we do actually have a question coming in from Mary asking where we can find each of these. So is there an easy answer for where we can find these?
So the ones that I chose for this workshop are ones that I see growing pretty commonly in gardens around New York City. So that's where I've been seeing them. For example, I've been working a lot at our teaching garden on Governor's Island, and I've seen all these plants there. And that's a place where it's open to the public on the weekends. So Saturdays, Sundays, 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. You can head on over to the teaching garden and find these plants, and the public is allowed to harvest from them under the supervision of the people we have working out there. So that's one way to find it. If you can find a community garden near you, there's a lot of Green Thumb community gardens in New York City that allow people open hours just to come in. And since these are not things that someone is intentionally planting, generally it's more acceptable to just ask, a gardener there, like, oh, you're not using all this mugwort I see over here. Do you mind if I take some? So looking around for that kind of thing is the way I usually do it. A lot of these I do see back from when I lived in California. I saw a lot of these plants there too. So I'm not sure where everyone's tuning in from today, but they're pretty common in the places I've been. All right, so mugwort is a perennial plant. It's classified as an invasive plant. because it's just really taken over the ecosystem and does sometimes push out other species of plants. So this is one of those ones where you don't have to worry about depleting the source, because even if we tried really hard and got like everyone on this call to start pulling up and harvesting mugwort, there would still be more mugwort. It's a very persistent plant. So this is one I don't feel bad taking a lot of. It's used as a medicinal plant in Asian and European regions. So you might be able to find a lot of good recipes from those backgrounds. The way to identify it is one of the telltale signs is that it's a green leaf on the top. And then if you kind of flip the leaves over, you'll see that it's a little silvery. So these ones, let's see. So this one is interesting in terms of the way it spreads. And so it has rhizomes underground where it's spreading. So if it pops up in one area of your garden, it can spread the rhizome underground and pop up in another area. And the more you weed it, the more the rhizomes break apart and create more opportunities for new stems to pop out. So it's kind of like the more you weed it, the more comes out. So an interesting thing that we do at the Teaching Garden on Governor's Island, sometimes we don't actually try to pull it up from the rhizome because that can just be more opportunities to spread it. So a lot of times people will actually just cut it at the base, and that's their way of keeping the mugwort population in check. But these ones, mugwort is used for a lot of different things. You can make tea with it. We have a recipe, which I'll show you in the next slide, to make rice cakes with it. We did an herbal remedies workshop last month, and my coworker Chantel had a cool way of making a smudge stick out of mugwort leaves that is kind of like a cleansing smoke stick that you can use to cleanse the air. So we have some recipes on that. And if you go to the next slide, this is mugwort dream cakes that one of my coworkers made after they took some mugwort from our garden. So in the follow-up resources, we'll give you the directions for this, but these are the ingredients that you need. All right, next slide. Okay, so this one, it's not really a weed that people are trying to get rid of. This is just a naturally occurring tree or plant. It's wild sumac. It is pretty easily identifiable once you know what it is. Some people worry like, oh, is that poison sumac? But if you look up a picture of poison sumac, it looks way different than this. But these are really cool plants that are native to the Northeast. And I wanted to include them in this workshop because if we go to the next slide, you can see that you can make wild sumac lemonade out of the berries that are on the sumac drupe. So this is a really cool like foraging project that we recently did. Wild sumac has a type of acid complex in it that makes it similar to lemons. So what you can do is remove the drupe. You can take the berries off and bring it to simmer in a pot of water and then turn off the heat and let it just continue infusing. The directions for the recipe that we found said to filter it because there are some very fine hairs on the berries that might irritate some people's throats. So just filter it through like a coffee filter, and then you can sweeten it with honey or maple syrup, and it makes a pink lemonade, which is a really cool project to do. And the beverage, I just saw someone asked it. I actually haven't tasted it. My coworker made it, but she said it did taste quite a bit like lemonade because it has not the exact same like acid in it as lemons do, but a very similar one. All right, we can go to the next slide. So for this section, I just wanted to go over some underutilized plant parts. A lot of you may know these already, or you might have your own hacks for using the less common parts of plants. But let's go to the next slide and see if anyone can recognize what this plant is. So I'll give you a moment to put it in the chat. Can't see the chat. Are people guessing, Sophia?
Yes, we have a lot of answers saying carrots, carrot tops, Queen Anne's lace. So we got a mugwort.
Okay.
Carrots.
Yeah, those are good guesses. The correct one is carrot tops, but I love that someone put Queen Anne's lace because that's actually related to carrots and is known as like the wild carrot. But you're not supposed to eat Queen Anne's lace, I'm pretty sure. That's not good for humans. But yeah, these are carrot tops, and it does look a tiny bit like mugwort, which is why I put it in there to try to fool some people. So yeah, these are carrot tops though. And if you remember, if you're looking and you're not sure if it's carrot tops or mugwort, you can always look at the undersides of the leaves, and that should be a sign, one sign that it's, if it's silver, it's probably mugwort. If it's not, it's carrot tops. All right, next slide. So carrot tops are edible. This is a recipe that I've noticed has become more popular in the last few years, is to make a pesto out of carrot tops. You can do it, the recipe I put up here, you use 1 cup of carrot tops and 1 cup of basil leaves, so that you still get that basil flavor. You could do all carrot tops if you really like the flavor of them, but pesto is kind of fun. You can, instead of carrot tops, you can use, or basil, you could use, you know, young kale or spinach. You can kind of be very flexible with your pesto recipes. So when you get a fresh bunch of carrots, yeah, feel free to save the tops and use them for pesto. A little hack is that you can roast the carrots in the oven, make a carrot top pesto to put on top of the roasted carrots. That's a way to use the entire plant in a meal. All right, next slide. Kale stems are something that we often discard, but you can use them. They're full of fiber and nutrients, so they're really good for you, but they are very tough. So the way to get the toughness out of the kale stems is to blanch them. So you boil a pot of water, you can add a little bit of salt to it, put the kale stems in for just a minute, take them out and put them in ice water or just run them under a little cold water, and then they're much more easy and more delicious for eating. So this is something you can add it into that pesto recipe from the previous slide. They're also like a really good, they kind of are like broccoli, so you can add it to stir fries or anything else you would add broccoli to. So that's kind of a fun thing to do, to use the whole plant. Next slide. So celery leaves are something that you can actually eat as well. You can use it as an herb substitute for parsley. Tastes very similar. I like to put them in salads. Next slide. And then another thing, if you are gardening and you harvest your broccoli flower, you can use the leaves from broccoli and cauliflower. They're all brassicas. They're all extremely similar plants, like almost identical genetically. So you can actually make really tasty kale chips out of broccoli and cauliflower leaves. So you do it the same way you make kale chips, which is to salt and put olive oil and salt on the leaves, put it in the oven and let them get nice and crispy. And you've got a fun snack. All right, next slide. And the last section for today is just a quick list of edible flowers. If you go to the next slide, we have a list that is not exhaustive, but these are things that I see growing in a lot of gardens that you might not know are edible for humans. So nasturtiums are one of my favorites. They have a peppery, spicy flavor to them. You can eat bee balm if you pull off the little petals and you can suck on them and they taste very sweet. And you can also sprinkle that into lemonade, salad, on top of cupcakes, anything like that. There's a lot on this list here. So we've got borage, pansies, cornflower petals, calendula, daylilies, which is something I actually didn't know before making this workshop, are actually edible, kind of in a similar way that squash blossoms are. You can eat zinnias petals. They're a little bitter, so I wouldn't have a salad completely of zinnia petals, but you can do it. And then we've got a lot of other ones on there. So we can send you this list in the follow-up resource too. And then on the next slide is just a photo of a salad that I made using edible weeds. I threw in a piece of kale as well, just to like make it a little more full. And then you can top it with all your edible flowers to make it look very beautiful. All right. So if the next slide is just some additional resources for some of the things I talked about today, and we'll send these to you in the email as well. And up next, we can start to take some questions. You can go to the next slide, Colleen. And I just saw in the chat, someone was saying wild sumac is in the cashew family. So if you're allergic to cashews, you might be allergic to it, which is a very good note. Definitely check your allergies on any of the stuff we went through today, because I'm not a doctor.
Yeah, and feel free to keep posting your questions in the question and answer section, but we can get started with a few of these. So our first question comes from Tamia, who asked, I know we're supposed to clean or rinse foods before we eat them. Should we also clean the flowers if we plan on eating them?
Yeah, it's up to you. If you are picking them right from your garden and you know that there's no contaminants on them, sometimes I skip that step. But if you're getting it from like a community garden and you don't know who's been in there doing stuff, it doesn't hurt to like very lightly wash off the flowers.
Yeah, that sounds right. We have a few questions on if we are going to send these slides out, and if so, will we include the photos?
Yeah, I can do that. I'll make sure I send you all the deck from today.
Great. Thanks, Laura. We have one question asking if mugwort has a kind of lemony fragrance.
I don't know the answer to that. Does anyone know how they would describe the mugwort fragrance?
You can put it in the chat if you.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know my coworker has made a smudge stick out of it, but I haven't. So I don't know exactly what it smells like.
Mm-hmm. Farah asked, is pokeweed the same as spinach?
I don't think so. I think those
are
different plants. Right, Colleen, do you know the answer to that one?
What was it? What is the same as spinach?
Pokeweed? I'm pretty sure that's like a very different thing.
Yeah.
I don't even know if they're related.
Oh, we have another.
They're 100% different.
Okay.
Plants.
Okay. And also I see in the chat, some people were weighing in on the smell of mugwort, and someone says not citrusy at all. Other people have not noticed a lemony flavor. And someone said it's like chrysanthemum. So those are some tasting notes or smelling notes.
Another question from the chat from Uriel is, at what stage do you pick the flowers to eat?
So you would just pick them when they're blooming. So that's pretty straightforward when you're growing them. I do like especially with nasturtium, I kind of have to stop myself because I love eating them, but pollinators also love them and they bring a lot to the garden. So I do make sure I leave some behind for the pollinators to eat from as well.
And we've gotten a few responses that pokeweed can only be eaten at certain times because otherwise it can be poisonous and only can be eaten when it's young. So I would just say to be careful with your pokeweed.
Yeah, that's something to look up because I'm not familiar with pokeweed personally.
Beverly asked if we have a list of markets that accept SNAP to purchase edible plants or seeds to grow food.
Yeah, you can use SNAP at any of our food access sites, so any green market, and SNAP can always be used to buy edible plants and seeds. We have, if you go on GrowNYC.org, there's a locator. Let me see if I can put that in the chat really quick. And yeah, you can, they always have, just look for the market tent, the market GrowNYC tent. So I just put in the chat where you can look up your green market or food box site and definitely use your SNAP there.
Great.
EBT as well, pandemic EBT if anyone has.
Mm-hmm.
Amy asked if any of these weeds can be dried or frozen for later use.
That's a good question, and I'm not sure the answer to all of that. A lot of the ones that I showed, I've only eaten fresh, so I'll say that. But if someone else in the chat knows otherwise, would love to hear more from you. I think some of the weeds I was saying are a very high water content, like the purslane. And so I wouldn't think to dry that one. I think it tastes good because it's fresh and crunchy and filled with water. I know mugwort can definitely be dried, and dandelions. So those are two that you can dry.
Lauren asked how tall or bushy are these so I can find them. If you just like to clarify which weeds or plants you're referring to so we can maybe better answer this question, that would be great.
Yeah, they're all different as well. So in this workshop, as you saw, I only showed you like one, maybe two pictures of each weed. So this is definitely just something to get you started. And I encourage you to look up more photos so that you can identify them with a lot more certainty. As we said, 100% certainty so that you don't eat something you shouldn't by accident. So look them up. There's like books for identifying weeds, edible weeds and things like that too, if you like doing that more than Googling. But either way, definitely look up more pictures or find someone. If you're in a community garden, there's usually other gardeners who know a lot about the edible weeds and they can teach you in person. Sometimes like the parks, sometimes I see other workshops that people go around and will show you what the edible weeds are in real life too. That always helps me.
And I think the thing too is like mugwort, you'll never see just one plant by itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like you might see one dandelion, but a mugwort just will take over a spot where it's been allowed to grow. And at least in my neighborhood, it's really growing and taking over street tree wells that have sort of been left abandoned.
Okay.
And it's really can be quite tall and bushy, well over knee high. I mean, I'm 5'6", so it can get as tall as, past my knees.
Yeah.
And we definitely have folks who come through and whack it all down to harvest. So that one's like, you'll find it en masse growing.
Yeah.
Not a singular plant.
Yeah. And that's a good point, Colleen. There are some weeds that I found are much easier to identify with certainty than others. So Colleen, would you be able to bring us back to the lemon wood sorrel slide? Because I remember there's a good thing I can tell you that will help you identify it like 100% every time. And while she's doing that, Joan in the chat is recommending iNaturalist app is a good app for plant identification. And I definitely agree with that. Everyone loves using iNaturalist and they'll help you identify stuff. Mm-hmm. So here with lemon wood sorrel, I think you can see in the picture how it looks kind of like clover, but it's not. It's a different type of plant and the leaves are heart-shaped. So that's one way you can always identify, at least this weed, is making sure that the leaves have that heart shape to them, because that's very unique.
Yeah, and just jumping on sorrel, Aurora in the chat asked if we see sheep's sorrel in the New York area, and is it also edible? I'm not sure about that, but maybe
sheep's sorrel.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that one either.
Hmm.
I guess, okay, I just looked. It says it's a red sorrel, also known as sheep's sorrel or sourweed. Okay, I've heard of sourweed. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where that grows, but that would be something to look into. I can try to find a resource on that and put it in the follow-up resources.
That's interesting.
In the chat, Colleen just said that her son just brought some sorrel in to try, and there was a lemon burst. We appreciate
That's awesome. Yeah, I lemonwood sorrel is fun. Yeah, I hear people call it lemon hearts as well, which is another way to remember that it's heart-shaped leaves.
And do we have any information on wild plantain?
Was wild planting? I wondered.
Plantain.
Oh, wild plantain.
Yeah.
I don't. No. Yeah, I don't. I know that's a weed that I've seen around. I didn't know it was edible. Yeah, I'm not sure about wild plantain.
For my quick search, I only know that it's edible because my tortoise eats it. But it can be eaten by humans. Sort of, you want to eat it young. Kind of tastes like spinach. Use it in salads and sandwiches. And again, once it gets older, it'll be
okay. Yeah, I'm reading now. It's finding the same thing. It is an edible weed, and
that's definitely a common New York City weed.
I see that everywhere. That's so cool. I didn't actually know that one.
Yeah.
Some people in the chat are also saying you can chew it and put it on bug bites, and it'll help with the itching, which I've heard of that, and that's really cool. I'm glad they brought that up.
Try that on my son.
Kit asked if we have any curricula or ideas for teaching this info to youth. She teaches gardening and nature in the Bronx.
Oh, cool. We don't have an edible weeds like workshop for students or for youth at the moment, but if she wants to email us, I'd be happy to send her with our deck here so that she can adapt it for students. That's a really good idea. Colleen, if you want to bring us to the very last slide, it has our email on it. So if you have some follow-up questions or you wanted to get more materials from us, feel free to reach out at schoolgardens@grownyc.org. Do we have any other questions for today?
Not right now, no.
All right. Great. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. Yeah, I'll download this as a PDF and send it out in the follow-up resources. And if you need it in any other format, feel free to email schoolgardens@grownyc.org. But look out for that email tomorrow. It was great to chat with you all and hear some of your really creative and cool ways of using edible weeds as well. And we have some upcoming workshops in October. So I'll put that in the chat here if you want to sign up for those. They're mostly for school gardens and outdoor learning in New York City, but I'll send that also in the follow-up, so you'll get that. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Bye, have a good afternoon.
Bye.
All right, Sophia, you can end the webinar, I think.
Okay.